Hey guys, it's Greg Alexander again today, and today I want to talk about tidal river bass spawn. So there's a lot of differences between a tidal river or even a river, but especially a tidal river, and the type of places that a bass will spawn and the type of places you can catch them when they're spawning. Now there's all rivers, I have a video out there, all rivers are not created equal, and they're not created equal. Where I live, we have a lot of narrow, windy, high current, muddy, one Cypress River. And then just a little ways from where I live, an hour or two, is the Potomac River, which is completely different than the rivers right here next to home. The Potomac River is a big, wide river, a lot of sandy bottoms, a lot of areas that have, very little current or almost no current, a lot of grass certain years, and it doesn't fish like our windy, shallow current mud rivers. So that being said, we have mud rivers. We have some rivers that have big mud flats, but there's no current. Other rivers that are just windy and there's pretty much current almost everywhere. I mean, you almost can't find a place to even get out of the current. And then you have these wide, sandy bottom, big flats, grass rivers like the Potomac, the upper Chesapeake Bay. So understand that rivers are extremely volatile compared to lakes. I mean, lakes you might get a flood and the upper part of the lake might get dirty. You might get some wind, but you can probably get out of the wind somewhere. Rivers are always volatile. The current running hard one way, running hard the other way, stirring the bottom up, making it muddy, getting it silty. Barges coming up and down the river with loads of sand and gravel completely destroy the river. And it's a very volatile situation. So a bass won't spawn whether he's in a river or a lake. He's not going to spawn in any current other than a very slow running current. He's not going to spawn on the mud. He's not going to spawn where he lays his eggs and the silt is going to drop on his eggs. He's not going to spawn where barge traffic is happening. He's not going to spawn where people are water skiing or running boats up and down, up and down, up and down right next to him. And he's not going to spawn in a heavily shaded area. So on a lake, depending on the lake, there's some river run lakes that don't have near as many coves and whatnot, but on a lake, a bass can pretty much pick any hard bottom cove that gets some sun that's out of the direct business, I guess, of the lake. On a river, some rivers have very few options for places for the bass to spawn. On a river, there are, I would say, 4 options for a bass to spawn on. Option 1 would be man-made cuts. A little place where a community dug out an area to access homes through personal private docks. But these man-made cuts have to be maintained. They have to be in use, because in a river, if there's a man-made cut and it doesn't get used by boat traffic coming in and out constantly. One cut that I remember years ago, the guy actually had a pump in the back of his cut that circulated water in the cut and it kept it clean. Well, that guy moved years ago, and that cut you couldn't get into with a surfboard now on low tide. So I want to talk about 2 cuts in particular, man-made cuts, and how this operates in a river. 25 years ago on one of our rivers, they were taking an old bridge out and putting a new, and when they put the new bridge in order to access the one side of the bridge, they had to dig out a section for the big barge with the crane on it that put the bridge in order to finish the one side of the bridge. So they dug that whole section out next to the bridge so the barge could float in and out of there. Well, that particular cut, for several years, if you weren't fishing in that cut or a couple other cuts on the river in the spring, you lost. I mean, every fish in that section of the river basically went to that particular cut to spawn. Well, now that cut, 25 years later, you know, I haven't caught a bass in that cut in 15 years. And the reason why is it has silted in. So now there's 3 feet of soft muck in the bottom of it now, and it basically goes almost dry on a low tide. Then there was another bridge on the same river, down the river, even probably pushing like the saltwater limit of the river, where people wouldn't even have thought that a bass would live. But they took a bigger bridge out and they did the same thing. They made a right long, like probably 1/4 mile long or a little bit longer cut next to the bridge to finish building the bridge with the barge. And the first year that was kind of open to fishing, nobody really got onto it, but 2 guys got onto it. And in that tournament, first and second place came out of that cut in the spring. It was like April. And these guys, it was a 10 fish limit in the buddy tournaments back then. And these guys had the guys that won it had 8 fish, and the guys that finished second had 10 fish. Well, third place in that tournament was like 3 fish, 15-inch limit in the spring. And so these guys blew the field completely out. And they had done it in this cut, this almost saltwater cut. And of course it got out like everything does in fishing. And the next year there was 15 boats in there in the spring tournament. And guess where it was won? It was still won there, even with 15 boats there. And then there was one there again the next year after that. And then it started tapering off. After about 3 years, it started tapering off because this cut started silting in because it wasn't being used commercially to keep the bottom cleaned out. So that's one place that you can catch them in the spring spawn on a river, tidal river. The next place you can catch them in the spring spawn on a tidal river or a river would be a man-made marina. Okay, man-made marina. Areas of certain marinas will silt in and not be as good as when it was in the beginning. But a new marina is going to be absolutely killer. A new marina will be ridiculous how good the fishing will be in the spring. But even these marinas, a lot of these places in these marinas, people park their boats and they never move them. So certain areas of the marina will silt in and other areas will not. So keeping that in mind, the fish are going to use the areas that don't silt in these marinas. That's the second area they'll spawn in a tidal river or river. The third area that they'll spawn in a tidal river or river is in slow easing current areas that have hard bottom. Well, this could be, a side cove that's not muddy bottom, or generally towards the headwaters of a river. Because a lot of these rivers in the headwaters are dammed off and they have ponds or lakes coming into them. So, the farther up the river you go, a lot of times, not all rivers, but a lot of these rivers, the farther up you go, you'll get to a place where it's dammed off, and obviously the current's not going to run near as hard, and there won't be as many siltation issues. The water will tend to be more clear, and the fish will spawn in these headwater type areas. And then the last area that they'll spawn in a river are spillways. these same places I was just talking about, dammed off ponds, dammed off lakes, up the end of the river, up branches of the river, up little creeks of the river, where you have water coming in from a pond, very oxygenated, into a little pool area before it spills out into the river. And some of these areas can be, you know, great areas, because they're never going to silt in. These areas are never going to silt in because they have that flow, that oxygenated, turbid flow water coming from a nice clean pond, but there's not really current there, but it's very oxygenated. It's like putting an oxygenator in the water, and that's like the best thing for, you know, bass fry, is to have that. So that would be mostly the more narrow current type rivers. Now, there's some exceptions to that. If we take these larger rivers, like the Potomac River, like the Upper Chesapeake Bay, these rivers tend to have areas on them that have almost no current. Tide goes up and down, but there's almost no current. But they maintain, in certain areas, hard bottom. You know, they don't silt in because they don't have that constant flow, stirring the water, stirring it up, and then it silts in. They don't silt in near as bad. Or, in the case of Potomac and the Upper Chesapeake Bay, spring is a time of year when the milfoil starts to grow. And so this milfoil grows obviously out of the current in these harder bottom bays, and it acts as a buffer. Okay, it does several things. It provides cover for the fish. It filters out the silt, which is key because a bass doesn't want to lay its eggs in a silty area. And it stifles or stops the wind waves and the boat waves from stirring everything up where the fish would want to lay their eggs. So we also have another grass that grows a little bit later called eelgrass. Y'all know what it is. Peppergrass, I think they call it down in Florida. Up here we call it eelgrass. And then later on, when it warms up, you get the hydrilla, which that usually shows up a little bit after the fish start to spawn in a lot of these lakes and rivers. So the grass keeps the water clean, basically, and gives them cover. So if you have grass, milfoil in your river, and it's up at all, you can almost be guaranteed that the fish are going to be spawning somewhere in and around that. You know, unless it's like right in a current seam or something like that. So sight fishing on a tidal river, it's not something that happens a whole lot. You got a very short window of when you can actually see that fish on or around the bed. Now you can, and then we have a couple places year after year that you can see them towards low tide, either side of low tide a little bit. But, you know, once the tide gets up a little bit, you can't see that fish anymore. So it's not like it's you know, if you're watching these tournaments where these guys are power poled down and working a fish, you can do that for a very short period of time on a river, maybe. But most of the time on a river, tidal river, current river, you're going to be blind casting to where you think the fish are or where the fish is, and just fishing very slowly and fishing around them. And that's how you're going to catch them most of the time. I can count on one hand the number of fish I've caught on these rivers working him because I could see him. And something else that happens with them on a river, see, because they go from high tide feeling pretty secure to low tide with a couple inches of water over top of their back on their bed, and they feel very insecure. So they can be really flighty, you know, in a tidal river situation when that tide drops down to the point where you could actually see them, and it makes them very difficult to catch throwing at them. So lures. Let's talk about lures, and you know, whatever lure you could catch them on sight fishing on a lake, you could probably catch them on sight fishing or bed fishing, blind bed fishing on a river. But rivers, again, bass tend to really kind of like smaller lures on a river. So lures that I would choose for spawning bass on a river that type of year, it wouldn't be the big, loud, moving spinnerbait, chatterbait, crankbait deals. It would be small tubes, small size creature baits, Senkos, wacky rig, Texas rig, 4-inch, 5-inch Senkos, shaky head with a lightweight, and small jigs. And you know, I've been on the Potomac before, where if you've ever been on the Potomac in the spring, if you're around fish, you're around fishermen. I mean, literally some of these grass flats and some of these bays could have 100 boats within sight of you. And a lot of guys, you know, had been there a week or two before, and they were catching them on spinner baits and rattle traps and chatterbaits. And then you get in there on tournament day and there's 50 boats around, and you know, you might catch one on a chatterbait, or you might catch one on a spinner bait, and it might even be a good one. But the guys that win these spring tournaments in this grass on the Potomac Upper Bay are usually the guys who are willing to really downsize and slow down to catch these fish. And I learned that years ago on the Potomac. We fished a buddy tournament over there, and I didn't even know what a shaky head was. That's how long ago this was. And we got next to a guy on a grass flat, and people, you know, they're moving around. And we got close to this one guy, and he was catching them. And I looked at him, I thought, what the heck is he doing? And he was throwing this little tiny worm on this little tiny, I think it was a bullet head back then, not even a shaky head. And he was just solid catching them, and everybody else was struggling. And I didn't really even, at that time, really even own anything kind of like that. Or did I have the confidence to do that? But that's what it takes. And he wasn't throwing at fish he could see. He was just throwing it around through the grass and working it slow. And he whacked them when nobody else did. So later on, different tournaments, I whacked them when nobody else did. So got to talk about water temperature in a river, on a lake, a reservoir. You know, you'll see fish on beds as early as like 57, 58 degrees if it's been stable. Water's clear, it's sunny, we're on a full moon, new moon type deal. On a river, I've never, ever caught a fish I consider to be a spawning fish in water temperature less than 65, ever. And most of the time on a river, most of the fish aren't gonna spawn until that water temperature gets somewhere around 70 degrees. And I think it's just due to the volatility of a river, tidal river, that the fish know that their chances of having success spawning are greater as the season progresses a little farther than on a lake. See, because on a lake, you know, the barge is not going to come along and sweep away the fry or silt up their eggs, and the tide's not going to go out past where it normally does and cause all kinds of issues. There's just so much volatility. That warmer weather, that warmer water in a river, I think just, in the instincts of a fish, make them spawn a little bit later in the year. So that's an overall perspective of how the spawn works in rivers, tidal rivers especially. And next time you go to a tidal river in the spring, you'll understand the type of things to look for and what not to look for if you're trying to find fish on the beds. So again, if you like my content, I'd ask that you please subscribe to my channel, hit the like button and the little alert bell. It'll help me. It'll help you. Have a blessed day.